The white envelope trembled slightly in Ava Davis's hand. Even though she already knew what was inside, she opened it slowly, as if delaying it by a few seconds might somehow change the outcome. The bold red print appeared instantly cold and absolute final eviction notice. Ava leaned against the kitchen wall and closed her eyes. 6 years in this tiny apartment with its peeling walls but quiet corners and a window that looked out onto the communal lawn where her daughter once played was about to end. They had exactly 72 hours to leave. She couldn't remember the last time she had slept through the night. The past 3 months had been an unending cycle, filling out applications, sending emails wearing the same suit, whose sleeves had started to fray, politely nodding at curt rejections. 97 job applications, 23 interviews, 0 offers. A small voice came from behind the door. "Mum." Ava, startled, quickly stuffed the paper into her pocket and forced a smile as her 11-year-old daughter walked in. Zoe Miller had bright, deep eyes that made adults uncomfortable because they seemed to see right through everything you tried to hide. "You okay, Mum?" "I'm okay, sweetheart. Just grown-up male, boring stuff." Zoe said nothing, just stared at her mother with that familiar, skeptical look. She always sensed what people didn't say. For example, Ava pretended to be cheerful after losing her job at Rivertech, and Zoe placed a cup of tea on the table and asked quietly, "They fired you, didn't they?" "We need to hurry. I have an interview at Quantum Dynamics in an hour." Zoe nodded and grabbed her worn backpack, which held her notebook filled with circuit sketches, some wires and a tablet she'd salvaged from the building's dumpster and brought back to life. "Can I bring my projects?" Ava hesitated. Today's interview was her last shot. Quantum Dynamics, a tech giant, where she got lucky she might land an administrative job that paid just enough to cover a new apartment and keep Zoe in school. But they didn't allow children. Things had gone off script since their kindly neighbor, who usually watched Zoe during interviews, suddenly left for Chicago to visit her grandchild. "You just have to sit still, not talk to anyone, okay?" Zoe nodded again, this time with a crooked smile. She didn't say those projects were her only comfort, where the world made sense through logic and where she could be herself without being told she was weird. 20 minutes later, they stood at the bus stop. Ava wore her only dark suit, cleverly using a scarf to hide a small tear near the collar. Zoe clutched her notebook, her fingers tracing the hard edge of the cover where she often sketched security systems based only on old books and free tech forums at the public library. The bus crept toward them like a tired snake in the morning traffic. Ava gripped her daughter's hand as they boarded. She tried to smile, but her ice-cold fingers betrayed the truth. "You're shaking," Zoe said softly. "Just nerves. This job's important." "Because we need money." Ava hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, but not just for money. Sometimes people need a chance to prove they can do something." Zoe didn't reply. She stared at her mother as if storing the sentence like a string of code in her memory. Quantum Dynamics headquarters rose before them like a glass fortress in the morning light, its reflective panels gleaming like a challenge. Ava swallowed hard while Zoe looked up at the towering building, not in awe, but analyzing how the security cameras were arranged. Inside Ava's head, a voice repeated, "Let today be the day everything changes." She didn't know that the one to change everything that day wouldn't be her. Stepping through the revolving glass door of Quantum Dynamics, Ava felt like she'd wandered into a world not meant for her. The main lobby was massive, with a ceiling high enough to echo like a cathedral. Everything was coated in glass marble and polished metal. A silent message, "We are the pinnacle. If you're not ready, you don't belong here." Ava gently squeezed Zoe's hand, her heart pounding erratically. She approached the reception desk, standing as tall as she could. "I'm Ava Davis. I have a 10:30 interview with HR." The woman behind the desk, flawlessly made up and with deep red nails, glanced at Ava and then at Zoe beside her, with the worn backpack and notebook hugged to her chest. "Children are not allowed on premises without prior notice," she said, her tone as cold as the building's central air. "I'm sorry, I didn't have anyone to watch her today. She'll sit quietly and won't disturb anyone. Please." The receptionist tapped a few keys, her stare still icy. "Wait over there," she said, pointing to a row of leather chairs in the corner. "But if there's any issue, we'll have to ask you both to leave." Ava nodded, swallowing the familiar taste of being judged. She was used to it. Zoe sat down, pulling out her notebook. Her eyes immediately locked onto the wall of security screens displaying footage from across the building. She watched streams of code flash in a corner like an action movie. Ava placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Just sit still here. Okay, remember?" "I remember, Mum." "And don't talk to anyone unless they talk to you." Zoe smiled faintly and bent over her notebook, beginning a new diagram, wires, nodes, and data ports. Ava took a deep breath, adjusted her collar, and walked toward the elevators. Each step felt like a tightrope between failure and the faintest hope. On the 32nd floor, Ethan Thomas, CEO of Quantum Dynamics, was reviewing his presentation one final time. His light grey suit was perfectly tailored, his black shoes polished to a mirror finish, and his salt and pepper hair neatly combed. In his hands was the keynote for the company's newest flagship, Quantum Shield, a cybersecurity platform claiming to be impenetrable. An assistant rushed in. "Mr. Williams and the investors are here. They're waiting in the conference room." Ethan nodded, straightening his tie. He knew today's presentation wouldn't just decide the product's future, it could define the company and his own. Back in the lobby, Zoe continued watching the data streams. Lines of code blinked green and blue, flickering in her eyes. Suddenly she squinted. Something wasn't right with the looped command. "The data is moving the wrong way." She tilted her head, sketching faster. Zoe muttered. "Why is there a loopback packet with a fake header, not system data?" She tilted her head further. It felt like solving a Sudoku puzzle where one number had been wrong. The system was being tricked from the inside. Waiting outside the interview room, Ava's phone buzzed. "Interview delayed 30 minutes due to technical issues. Please wait." She sighed. It was not the first time, but this time the technical issue was about to take them on a journey no one saw coming. Meanwhile, upstairs, Ethan's presentation was abruptly interrupted. Every screen turned red with a flashing error: "Unauthorized access detected. System lockdown initiated." Investor Marcus Williams frowned. "Is this part of the presentation?" Ethan froze. A chill crept down his spine. "No, we're under attack." Back in the lobby, chaos erupted. Employees darted back and forth, murmuring into earpieces, their expressions tight. A technician spoke too loudly. "Floors 18 to 29 locked down. The entire firewall's been breached." Zoe looked up, her gaze fixed on the screens. The streams of code were no longer just symbols. They were language. And she understood. She flipped a new page in her notebook and sketched a network architecture diagram. Her hand trembled with excitement. Then she whispered to her mother, who had just returned to the lobby after getting the delay notice, "Mom, their system is being hacked, but not from the outside." Ava looked at her daughter skeptically. But then she glanced at the notebook with complex diagrams drawn with textbook-level precision and felt a chill. "How do you know that?" Zoe pointed to the screen. The attacker left traces. They're very subtle, but if you look closely, you'll see they're tricking the system into thinking it's still safe. Ava looked again at her small daughter, brown-skinned in an old sweater, hugging a notebook filled with symbols and logic that even the chief engineer might struggle to understand. For the first time in her life, Ava felt fear not of failure, but of the possibility that her daughter was about to step into a world far bigger and far more dangerous, and maybe no one was ready to accept that. The quantum dynamics lobby had turned into a shattered anthill within 3 minutes. Disheveled employees in white shirts dashed past, one hand clutching phones, the other dragging half-closed laptops. The front desk became a hub of chaos, calls flooding in, sharp questions thrown out, and hesitant answers failing to mask panic. Zoe sat quietly in the leather chair tucked in the corner of the lobby, her back-straight eyes locked onto the wall of security monitors. No one noticed the brown-skinned 11-year-old calmly reading data streams as if flipping through a graphic novel. To the adults, the lines of code racing across the screen were nothing more than erratic noise. But to Zoe, they were the offbeat rhythms of a broken symphony. The data responses were desynchronized, and the authentication protocols had been tampered with. The system believed it was talking to itself, but it wasn't. This wasn't a programming bug, it was an elegant deception, a cyber attack. "Mum." Ava had just put her phone down, her face pale from another notification, and the interview had been postponed indefinitely. "Mum, someone is breaking their system." "Zoe, not now." "I'm not guessing. I see it. The response data is being edited manually. Someone's fooling both the system and the people managing it." Ava turned to her daughter. The girl's face showed no fear, only focus on a cold, sharp clarity. Zoe added another diagram to her notebook, her pencil racing across the page as if she couldn't keep up with her thoughts. At the far end of the lobby, a group of cybersecurity engineers debated frantically. One of them, Mason Moore, the lead engineer, eyes red from lack of sleep, walked past Ava and Zoe with a phone pressed to his ear. The entire 22nd floor lost access. Chen says the firewall was bypassed through the OAthS layer. "No, it's not DDoS. This is something smarter." Zoe jumped up. "Excuse me, sir." Mason turned, slightly annoyed. He didn't have time for kids. "You shouldn't be here." "I know where the problem is. It's in the identity authentication system. The encryption handshake protocol is reversed." Mason froze. That was not something a child would say. "Who told you that?" "I saw it. On the screen. There." Zoe pointed to a string of code still looping erratically. "You understand that stuff?" Zoe didn't answer. She opened her notebook, flipping to the latest page. It displayed a detailed map of the company's network system with vulnerabilities marked in red and annotations. Mason took the notebook. He was silent for a few moments, then looked up. "What's your name?" "Zoe. Zoe Miller." "How old are you?" 11. "And where did you learn this?" "The public library and online forums, but mostly, I guessed." A sharp, chilling alarm rang out. Red lights pulsed overhead. An automated voice echoed through the building. "Internal alert. All non-essential personnel, please evacuate the lobby area. Do not use elevators." Ava looked at her daughter, then at Mason. He spoke rapidly into his earpiece while handing Zoe's notebook to a sharply dressed older woman, Harper Anderson, Director of Operations. Harper flipped through the pages, frowning. "What is this child's play?" "I don't think so," Mason said, watching Zoe. "Mason, this is a security crisis. We don't have time to entertain children in the system." Zoe, standing beside her mother, lifted her head. "I don't need to be in the system. I need to watch the screens. What's attacking you isn't destroying things. It's showing that it can get in any time it wants. Harper paused. That matched what their team had feared. Mason stepped closer to Ava. I know this sounds strange, but I might need to talk to your daughter. Ava gripped Zoe's hand tightly, instinctively protective. She's just observing. She has nothing to do with this. But she pointed out something our team hasn't caught in 30 minutes, and if she's right… Harper interjected, her tone authoritative. If she's wrong and we allow access to the system, it's a major breach. People will be fired. If she's right, Mason replied, we may be saved from a multi-million-dollar catastrophe. Maybe even the company's future. Harper looked at Ava, then at Zoe. Finally, she exhaled. Take her to the control floor, but she doesn't touch the system, only observes. Zoe squeezed her mother's hand, eyes gleaming not because she was allowed, but because she knew she was right. The elevator doors opened on the 30th floor, home of the Internal Security Command Center, the digital heart of quantum dynamics. Unlike the chaos downstairs, this place was eerily quiet, only the tap of keyboards and the tense breathing of engineers bracing against an unknown assault. The glow of blue monitors lit their anxious, sleep-deprived faces. Zoe stepped into their midst, small and steady in her faded hoodie, worn sneakers and thick notebook clutched like an extension of her body. She didn't look at anyone, just stared at the massive main screen pulsing at the far end. Ava followed, feeling like she was leading her daughter into a war zone, not one of bullets, but of code where a single mistake could collapse an entire system. A deep voice cut through the room. Is this a joke? The man who had entered was Elijah Taylor, director of cybersecurity. Sharp-suited, sharp-eyed, the kind of man used to making hard calls. He looked at Zoe like she was a foreign object, dropped into his command center. A child. You're letting her. What? Play with computers? Mason stepped forward. She identified the authentication flaw in under 5 minutes. Just by watching the screens. We've been at this for over 40 years and still don't have a fix. Elijah looked from Ava to Zoe. Where did she learn this? Library, Zoe answered without pause. Library. His voice oozed skepticism. The room went tense, but Zoe wasn't rattled. She walked toward a console and pointed at a block of running code. The user authentication module is generating fake responses. It thinks it's talking to itself, but it's not. Check today's AYouth logs. You'll find identical requests but mismatched IPs. Elijah folded his arms, silent. Harper glanced at Mason and gave a nod. A nearby engineer typed a command. Within seconds, the truth spilled onto the screen. Damn, he muttered. Access logs matched Zoe's prediction perfectly. Elijah frowned. For the first time, he had no rebuttal. Zoe stepped closer to the console but stopped short of touching the keyboard. She turned to Mason. I'm not allowed to operate, right? Mason nodded. But I can guide. Zoe flipped her notebook and handed it to Harper. Inside was a detailed flowchart of the compromised authentication chain and a proposed solution. If we suspend the response routine temporarily, then initiate the backup defense layer, we can quarantine the attack in a sandbox without affecting the core system. A nearby engineer studied the diagram, then whispered to a colleague. She mapped the internal architecture accurately. No way. How could she know that? Elijah cut in. Stop. No one implements anything unverified from an unauthorized individual. She's not staff, no clearance. We don't know who she is. Ava held her daughter's hand tightly. Zoe stayed calm. She looked back at Elijah, voice low but clear. You don't need to know who I am. Just look at the results. Meanwhile, on the 32nd floor is the investor meeting room. CEO Ethan Thomas stood silent in front of a wall of red screens, each blinking with escalating alerts. Marcus Williams, lead investor, nearly shouted, "We've been waiting over an hour, and you let the whole system go down because of a glitch. Or is this some joke?" Ethan sighed. He had built this company from scratch. Sleepless nights coding in his college dorm, first contracts, failed pitches because he lacked pedigree or degrees. Now, in the middle of a crisis, he was told that an 11-year-old girl on the 30th floor had identified a flaw none of his team had. "Take me to the control room," Ethan said firmly. When the elevator doors opened, Zoe sat in an engineer's chair, feet dangling. In front of her was a wall of security protocols, a digital labyrinth. She wasn't typing, but just speaking. Mason typed based on her directions. Harper compared Zoe's diagrams with the live system, unable to hide her amazement. Ethan entered. The room froze. Zoe turned. His face reminded her of her father, a man she'd never met, only seen in an old photo, but with the same quiet strength. Ethan looked around. No one said a word. "You're Zoe?" "Yes." "You know what's happening?" Zoe nodded. "Someone wants to prove your system isn't secure, but they don't want to destroy it. They want to be seen." Ethan froze. At that moment, he saw his younger self, the boy he had once scolded for dismantling an old PC to see how it worked. He looked at Zoe, then Ava, her eyes filled with fear and pride. Ethan smiled. "Then let's give you the chance to prove it." The silence following CEO Ethan Thomas's approval was like a low electrical current humming through the room. A child, a breached system, a company on the verge of crisis. And now the potential savior was an 11-year-old girl. One engineer chuckled nervously from the back, unsure whether it was from skepticism or fear. Another muttered, "What if she's wrong?" Elijah Taylor, the director of cybersecurity, couldn't hold back anymore. He marched straight up to Ethan, his voice rising. "With all due respect, Ethan, this is insane." "What's insane?" Ethan replied, calm but firm. "Is that a national-level security system has been under attack for an hour and your expert team hasn't figured out the cause." Elijah's face turned red, his anger barely contained. "We're operating on the highest-tier infrastructure in the country, and you're letting a child intervene, no file, no background check, no legal accountability. She's not even on payroll. You're throwing open our back doors on a whim." Zoe remained seated. She neither bowed her head nor reacted, but her small fingers clenched the edge of the chair as if holding on to her stillness. Ava stepped forward, maternal instinct kicking in. "I'm sorry, we never meant for this to happen. If she's making anyone uncomfortable, we'll leave." Ethan raised a hand to stop her. "No, no one's going anywhere." He turned to the room, eyes scanning each face of engineers, department heads, advisors, those who feared losing control to an anomaly. "I understand your confusion, but I see something else very clearly. This girl is the only one giving us a concrete direction." Harper Anderson, head of operations, finally spoke her first words since Ethan arrived. She didn't touch the keyboard. She used her eyes and a notepad to identify nearly all the decoy signal packages. Most importantly, she's reading the system like it's her native language. Elijah wasn't finished. "There's no guarantee she's not behind the attack." Ava stiffened. But before she could respond, Zoe spoke not loudly, but with a blade-sharp clarity. "If I were the attacker, I wouldn't be sitting here showing you where it's broken." The room fell silent. Zoe's gaze didn't flinch, nor did it boast. It simply carried truth directly, clearly, and unafraid of suspicion. Mason Moore broke the silence. She identified the sandbox architecture from within, not from outside, from an internal understanding. Harper added, "And everything we're arguing about is because she has no credentials, no paperwork, no standard." Ethan turned back to Zoe. He crouched in front of her eye level, not looking down or up, just one human to another. "Are you sure about what you're seeing?" "I'm sure. This isn't a traditional breach. It's making the system believe everything's fine. Like, it's pretending to be itself." Ethan nodded slowly. "So if I gave you a control station, could you show us how to stop it?" Zoe took a deep breath. "I won't fix it for you, but I'll tell you what to fix." Elijah narrowed his eyes, voice slow and deliberate. "If anything goes wrong, I'll file a personal liability report, and Ethan, you'll answer to the board." "I will," Ethan replied without hesitation. "But if this young girl is right, we'll all have to answer a different question. Why did everyone here miss what she saw in under an hour?" A young engineer, quiet until now, spoke up. "I'll take her to my station. She can use the interface I've been monitoring for sandbox feedback." Ethan nodded. Zoe stepped down from her chair and followed the engineer toward the consoles, leaving behind a room full of mixed stares, suspicion, envy, awe, and fear. Ava sat down, hands tightly clasped. Her heart pounded, eyes fixed on her daughter's small back, climbing onto a tall swivel chair, feet not reaching the floor. A girl. A world not built for her, an opportunity she never asked for but earned through sheer intellect. Zoe put on the headphones and stared at the data streaming across the monitor. Her eyes narrowed. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, not typing, just gliding. "I need authentication logs from 0800 AM and temporary access to the ID chain security system." Ethan looked at the engineer beside him. "Give her that access. Full access. Full access." The room held its breath, and then an 11-year-old brown-skinned girl began to unlock a maze that none of the powerful adults around her realized they were lost inside. The screen's glow illuminated Zoe's face like moonlight on a still lake. She didn't talk, didn't plead, didn't seek support. Zoe needed logic code flowing before her like a secret language only she could read. The adults in the room could feel it. They were witnessing something unusual, perhaps extraordinary. Ethan Thomas stood behind her, arms folded, eyes unblinking. He didn't see a child. He saw a mind doing what no one else in the control room had managed. "What's she doing?" one engineer whispered. "She's reading authentication feedback, like it's a diary," Mason murmured. Zoe never looked away from the screen. "Response signal 44 has a delay of 0.03 seconds. Too fast for human error. There's a bot in the middle." She turned to the engineer beside her. "Can you activate virtual IP layer timestamp comparison?" The engineer froze for a second and followed her lead as if under a spell. 3 commands later, a critical flaw lit up a vulnerability dormant for nearly 6 years, now exploited as a backdoor leading the entire system into simulation mode. Elijah Taylor stepped forward, staring at the screen, then took half a step back as if slapped by an invisible hand. Zoe spoke without turning. "This isn't a current error. It's an original design flaw. They're just exploiting it." She looked up at the main display, a massive network diagram, and pointed to one node. "If I block the authentication stream here, we can make the system realize it's being fooled." Ethan said nothing, just nodded. Zoe typed a few lines, slowly, deliberately, like a pianist playing a piece only she knew. The room was as silent as a cathedral. A message appeared. "Request to rewrite. ID gateway pathway granted." Zoe exhaled. Her tiny fingers touched the keyboard, honestly typing for the first time. Elijah nearly shouted, "Ethan, stop this. This can't continue. It's illegal." Ethan turned to him. "Elijah, look at the only thing we have right now, a child who understands this system better than the people who built it. I used to be that child. The only difference is that no one ever gave me a keyboard." Elijah was stunned. For the first time, he had no reply. 10 minutes passed. Zoe no longer looked at the keyboard. Every movement came instinctively. She wrote commands, adjusted lines, and passed logs, pushing the system to new frontiers. Mason stared at the dashboard. "We're receiving normalized responses again. It's stabilizing. Data layers 18 to 29 have resynced," another engineer confirmed. "Peripheral servers are exiting sandbox mode." Gradually, the room's despair was replaced by relief keystrokes, growing confident again. Red turned to amber, then green. After nearly an hour of tension, the system was finally recognizing itself. Ethan stood still, arms by his sides, eyes fixed on Zoe, like someone watching a star discovered at noon. Zoe turned to the engineer. "Now restart the main authentication layer. Use the update I just patched." She just referred to herself as I. The engineer whispered, unable to hide his smile. Zoe stood up. The screen stabilized. "Done." The room froze. People glanced at one another, not daring to believe. A message blinked. "All systems restored. No active threat detected." Then, as if someone had flipped a switch, the room erupted in applause, hesitant at first but genuine and loud. Harper nodded, eyes glistening. Mason gave Zoe a gentle pat on the shoulder, as if afraid to startle her. Ava stepped forward and embraced her daughter. "Are you okay?" Zoe looked up. "Mum, I don't know if I'm happy or just tired." Ava laughed through her tears. Ethan approached, kneeling to meet Zoe at eye level. "You know, it's been a long time since I saw something that reminded me who I used to be. I just wanted to help. And you did what no one else here could." Ethan stood and addressed the entire room. "Today we were taught by an 11-year-old that talent doesn't have a fixed shape. And sometimes, to save an entire system, all it takes is looking in the right direction." At the far end of the room, Elijah said nothing. He turned away, face stiff. No one noticed his glance at the security console. No one heard him mutter, "A design flaw from 6 years ago." Meanwhile, Zoe stepped down, picking up her now thicker notebook. She walked toward her mother, her small hand slipping into Ava's. Ava bent down. "You just saved a multi-billion-dollar company." Zoe pondered a moment, then said, "So, does that mean they can help us pay rent?" Ava burst into laughter, tears still in her eyes. Inside the expansive control room of quantum dynamics, no one looked away from the central screen where a simple message had just appeared. "Systems stable, no threats detected." A collective sigh swept through the room, breaking the tension that had gripped it for hours. Engineers slumped over their consoles. Department heads let their hands fall from their temples. Fingers that had once typed commands in desperation now rested limply on keyboards. Zoe Miller stood at the center, an 11-year-old girl with neatly tied curly hair and a calm expression, as if she had just solved a math problem in class. A child who had just stopped a full-scale cyber attack that stumped the top-tier security team for nearly 2 hours. Ethan Thomas, the CEO, stood next to Ava, still dazed like a woman waking from a dream. "We just witnessed something no one thought possible," Ethan said, as if speaking not to the room but to his conscience. "Talent has no limits. Only society creates them." Harper Anderson, once the loudest skeptic, stepped toward Zoe. Her gaze no longer held rigid control, but admiration and gratitude. "You just saved this company, its reputation and the future of thousands of employees." Zoe hesitated slightly. She wasn't used to praise. What she had done wasn't for applause. She simply couldn't sit by and watch a system being manipulated. They left traces, Zoe said, eyes fixed in mid-air as if replaying lines of code in her mind. Not to destroy, but to be seen. Ethan frowned. What do you mean? Zoe flipped to the latest page in her notebook where she had sketched the tampered code. The attacker didn't hide. They even left a signature in the authentication reroute commands. Someone wanted to prove they could still get in even after being locked out. Harper studied the diagram, then turned to Ethan. This wasn't a random hacker. This was a message, Mason muttered through his teeth. An insider, Zoe nodded, or someone who used to be inside. Ethan fell into a thoughtful silence. An old hunch stirred not fear, but guilt. But before they could delve deeper into motives, a man who hadn't taken his eyes off Zoe since the start stepped forward. Elijah Taylor, director of cybersecurity. Young lady, he said, his voice heavier now, where did you learn all of this? Zoe looked straight at him. At the public library, in technical forums, and from fixing old computers behind my school. Impossible. Elijah shook his head. No one learns this level without formal training. No one sees our system architecture without privileged access. Ethan stepped in. Elijah. No, Ethan, he snapped. This isn't about feelings. This is a major security breach. How does a kid know our internal algorithms? She's here during the attack, and now she knows who sent the malware. The room turned cold. Zoe clutched her notebook. Ava stepped forward. She has nothing to do with the attack. She just... And what authority do you have to claim that... Elijah cut in. No security clearance, no verified background. And this child just touched the core system. Ethan strode toward Elijah. His voice was low but unyielding. I authorized it. You're risking everything for a child. No, Elijah. I'm trusting the truth. Elijah looked around. All eyes were on him, some sympathetic, most quietly accusatory. Suddenly, he felt like a stranger in the room where he'd once held the most power. He turned away and muttered, I'll log this in the internal report. As Elijah left, Zoe sat back at the control desk. The screens were now calm, but the data stream was still like a lake after a storm. She sighed. For the first time, I feel tired. Mason poured her a glass of water and handed it over. Thank you, Zoe, not just for the system, but for reminding us not to judge everything by a CV. Zoe smiled, faintly shy. Ava took her hand and whispered, You did great, Zoe. Zoe looked up, her eyes clear but deeply aware. Mum, if I hadn't proven myself today, no one would have ever believed me. Right, Ava said nothing. She only squeezed her daughter's hand. Ethan stood behind them, a strange mix of sorrow and clarity rising in his chest. This child must never be overlooked again. 2 days later, sunlight streamed through the glass windows of Quantum Dynamics' top floor, glinting off the polished conference table like cold steel. Only 3 people sat inside: Ethan Thomas, CEO, Harper Anderson, head of operations, and Zoe Miller, the 11-year-old with a faded canvas backpack beside a chair much too large for her. Zoe held a printed file and extracted logs from the previous malware attack. Beside her, a notebook filled with tiny, precise handwriting. Harper tapped the table lightly. Are you sure about what you saw in the code? Zoe nodded without hesitation. An old encrypted signature was hidden in the final response. It wasn't harmful, but intentional. A single string of characters, AG. Ethan straightened in his seat, his face hardened. AG, he said quietly. Aiden Garcia. Harper frowned. Who's that? Ethan looked out the window for a long moment before replying. 5 years ago, we dismissed an independent engineer named Aiden Garcia. No degree, no formal training. But he had an uncanny intuition for authentication systems. He was the first to identify a flaw in our early security architecture. Harper narrowed her eyes. So why fire him? Ethan said nothing, but Harper could guess because Aiden didn't fit the mold. No one knew where he had studied, and no elite university was behind him. Aiden was a void in a hiring system where academic credentials were the golden ticket. Elijah didn't believe his warnings, Ethan said heavily. And without a resume, we removed him easily. Zoe whispered, "He just wanted to be heard." The room fell silent. The malware Zoe had dissected bore strange characteristics. It didn't corrupt databases, steal data, or encrypt for ransom. Instead, it mimicked damage just enough to trigger panic without causing real harm. "I think," Zoe continued, "he just wanted to prove he was right, that the fault wasn't his, but that no one listened." Harper nodded slowly. A voice echoed in her head. "Technology is fair, but systems are not." Ethan looked at Zoe, his eyes heavy. "You saw what no one in this company did. And you also understood why he did it." "Because I've been invisible too," Zoe replied, soft but piercing. Ethan fell silent. For the first time in years, he saw himself as someone who had once turned away, not out of cruelty, but convenience. "I want to find Aiden," he said, "not to punish him, to bring him back." Zoe smiled gently. "He won't trust easily." "I know, but we owe him that try." Harper interjected, "We need to do more than fix one mistake." She turned to Zoe. "You didn't just save a system, you exposed a hole bigger than any security flaw, how we judge people." Zoe said nothing, but Ava, standing just outside the meeting room with a cup of coffee, heard every word. A single tear slid down her cheek, not from sadness, but because for the first time her daughter was truly seen. Zoe and her mother were invited to tour the company's tech center that afternoon. They passed engineering floors, code review chambers, and classified R&D units. And everywhere people looked at Zoe, not with suspicion anymore, but with respect. On the top floor, Harper led them to an empty room. "We're redesigning the R&D lab for people like Zoe," she told Ava. "Those without resumes, but with a powerful tech instinct. People who need access to knowledge, not paperwork." Zoe looked around. She said nothing, but was already mapping out the lab in her mind test. Benches, mini-servers, circuit boards, routers. Harper turned to Ethan. "What's the program called again?" Ethan smiled, unboxed. Harper raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Because talent doesn't come in a box." That night, when Zoe and her mother returned to their small apartment, Ava received a message from Quantum Dynamics' HR department. "We are honored to offer Ms. Ava Davis the position of project lead for Unboxed. A formal contract will follow tomorrow morning." Ava set down her phone and looked at her daughter flipping through her notebook under the warm desk light. Today was a strange day, wasn't it? Zoe didn't look up. "Not that strange, Mom. I think it's the day people finally started seeing differently." The Monday morning board meeting began precisely on time at 8:00 a.m. in the 40th floor Alpha conference room, which had glass walls overlooking the entire city, as if the participants were running the world from above. 12 sharply dressed men and women stared intently at CEO Ethan Thomas. Behind him, the screen displayed the title, "The Attack on the 14th Events and Aftermath." No one smiled. No one joked. Everyone knew what happened that day was the first significant crack in the impenetrable reputation Quantum Dynamics had spent a decade building. "We need a detailed report, Ethan," one member said, tapping a fountain pen against the ebony table. "There are still too many gaps in the story." Ethan stood calmly. "Here's the truth. Our system was attacked through an exploit that's existed since version 3.1 6 years ago. The first person to identify the vulnerability was Aiden Garcia, an engineer we dismissed for lacking credentials. And who discovered it this time? Ethan raised his head. An 11-year-old girl, Zoe Miller. No resume, no degree, but capable enough to see what our entire security team missed. The room fell silent with a few furrowed brows, a few quiet people exhale. And you allowed this child access to the core system? Ethan nodded. I didn't just allow it, I bet on it. An older female board member with silver-rimmed glasses leaned forward. And if that child had failed, then we would have still failed. But at least this time, we wouldn't repeat our old mistake dismissing brilliance because it doesn't fit the mold. A deeper voice chimed in. Are you talking about changing how we hire? Ethan nodded again. I'm talking about changing how we define human value in this industry. You want this company to be a haven for uncredentialed prodigies. I want it to be a place where if a kid can save our system, she gets heard, not tossed aside for lacking paperwork. A subtle shift moved through the room. Eye contact was exchanged. The idea was bold and disruptive to the old order. The CFO spoke. Do you realize the legal risk of letting a minor under the legal working age access top-secret infrastructure? I do, and I'm willing to take responsibility. Ethan clicked to the next slide. Project Unboxed. This isn't just a lab. This is the first step toward a new network where talent is discovered before it's overlooked. No hiring based on paperwork, only on real capability. Who evaluates that? An independent council, including those previously excluded by the system like Aiden Garcia. And if you agree, Zoe Miller. A quiet stir of conversation. An 11-year-old. As an advisor to a billion-dollar tech company, one conservative-looking board member said, "We build technology, not charity." Ethan smiled softly. Exactly, and technology exists to change the world. To do that, sometimes you have to listen to voices that don't sound like the rest. No further objections came. Ethan straightened his suit jacket. I'm not asking for unanimous agreement today, but as CEO, I'll say quantum dynamics has survived on technology. It will endure by humility. A few seconds later, the eldest board member, a veteran executive, spoke. You'll have provisional approval. But Ethan, yes. If this fails, don't expect another room willing to hear about a child again. Ethan nodded. He understood, but he had no regrets. That afternoon, in a small office on the 12th floor, Ava Davis signed her official contract as Unboxed's program director. Zoe sat beside her legs, swinging sketching circuit designs on paper. An HR rep placed a nameplate on the table. Zoe Miller, honorary advisor, specialist in unstructured response systems. Zoe looked at her mum and whispered, "Mum, I don't even know what that title means." Ava laughed, ruffling her daughter's hair. It means they're starting to understand how good you are, even if they haven't found the right words yet. That evening, Ethan drove to an old neighborhood on the outskirts of town. He knocked on the door of a modest house, glowing with a soft yellow light. A man opened the door, disheveled hair, tired eyes, yet unmistakably sharp. Aiden Garcia. Ethan removed his glasses, paused, then spoke. I came to say, I was wrong. Aiden said nothing, but when Ethan handed him a small USB, placing it in his palm, Aiden's gaze shifted. Is that the attack data? Ethan nodded, and the profile of a girl who saw what you saw 6 years ago. Aiden stared for a long moment, then stepped aside. Come in. Aiden's workspace wasn't impressive by the world's standards, just a small room, walls yellowed by time, a chipped wooden desk, an old monitor, custom-rigged scattered circuit boards, and walls pinned with hand-drawn schematics, intricate, tangled, and perfectly logical. Ethan sat quietly, taking it all in. This room was a miniature research center. It screamed, Aiden never stopped thinking. The world had just stopped believing. Aiden poured 2 cups of tea, sliding one to Ethan. No questions, no long preamble. He'd already read everything he needed in Ethan's eyes. The girl. She did it, Aiden asked, voice low and weary like a long exhale. Ethan nodded. Not just did it. She understood what you once saw before we all ignored you. Aiden fell silent. His eyes drifted to a diagram on the wall with a handwritten note. Shouldn't have stayed silent. You're not the only one who went quiet, Ethan said gently. We let too many like you disappear from the system. And now, Ethan looked him in the eye, firm. I need you back, not to fix mistakes, to be the first teacher. Aiden frowned. I'm not a good teacher. Not to teach like a professor, to see what classrooms don't, to help build a space where kids like Zoe don't wait for miracles, just someone to believe in them. Aiden didn't reply, but Ethan could tell he was thinking of his younger self. 10 or 20 years ago, a boy tearing apart TVs to see how they worked, only to be scolded for breaking things. He closed his eyes, breathed deeply, then asked, Where's the girl? 3 days later at Project Unboxed's temporary lab, Zoe was reconstructing a security simulation in her own way. She assembled code blocks like Lego, but in logic and syntax. When the door opened and Aiden walked in, Zoe looked up. They locked eyes. No words for 10 seconds. No need for introductions. No explanations. It was as if they'd already known each other, not by name, but by instinct. They were the same kind, seeing the world through angles others missed. You're Aiden, Zoe asked. Aiden nodded. And you're Zoe. I read your code, very smart. Aiden sat beside her, quietly studying her simulation. You patched Quantum's feedback sandbox, very cleanly. Not as clean as yours. I only fixed what you left behind. They shared a soft laugh, not like a student and a professor, but like 2 coders swapping ideas on an open-source project at a round table. Aiden pulled out an old weathered leather notebook, handing it to Zoe. I used to write here what I couldn't post on GitHub, because I knew, if I did, they'd ask, where did you study, instead of, is it correct? Zoe flipped through the pages. Handwritten code is tight, precise, and efficient, just like hers. I used to think I was the bug in the system, Aiden said softly. Now I think, maybe the system is the bug. Zoe looked up. Are you coming back? If you want backup on this crazy project, then I do. Aiden smiled, a rare, quiet smile, one that said, I'm in. That afternoon, Ava walked past the lab, spotting Zoe explaining her new anomaly detection algorithm to Aiden. She broke down IP deviation thresholds with the excitement of sharing music. 2 unqualified coders talk like jazz musicians in the logic language. Ava stood still. Part of her still couldn't believe this was real. A man once discarded by the system, a girl who used to sketch server layouts on the dinner table. Now side by side, not as misfits, but as trailblazers. Ethan joined her, coffee in hand. She looks at home. Ava nodded. She's happiest doing what she's meant to do. We often forget. Being good at school isn't the same as doing what you're born to do. They stood in silence, watching through the glass. Inside, Aiden and Zoe were building a network model, not just for quantum systems, but for a future in which those once overlooked would be the ones who lead. Zoe Miller never imagined she'd have to speak to the press one day. But that Saturday morning in the main hall of Quantum Dynamics, under a barrage of camera flashes, stood an 11-year-old girl wearing a hoodie with a Rubik's Cube print and a lopsided ponytail surrounded by adults in suits holding microphones, name tags, and news cameras. Zoe, how does being the first to discover quantum's security flaw feel? Zoe, do you think you're a genius? Zoe, do you have any message for kids who dream of becoming computer scientists like you? Zoe looked at her mother, and Ava stood beside her holding her daughter's hand like an anchor in a storm. Zoe turned toward the cameras. I just saw what others didn't, and I don't think that makes me a genius. Sometimes people who don't speak loudly understand the most. Simple, honest, just enough to quiet the room for a moment. Then Project Unboxed was officially announced to the press. Harper Anderson laid out the alternative training vision. Aiden Garcia was introduced as the non-staff strategic technical advisor. Ava Davis was confirmed as the operational lead. And Zoe, she was labeled an honorary special advisor, but mostly sat quietly scribbling code into her notebook, while the press conference continued. To Zoe, what adults called recognition turning point or redefining STEM education were just long words. She only needed to keep working on what made sense to her, but within days the outside world started seeping into her quiet one. At school, Zoe became famous. She had once been the girl who sat in the back, sketching circuit boards on the backs of math notebooks. Now she was surrounded by unfamiliar stares and awkward questions. Hey, that's the girl who saved $1 million company. Zoe, do you play Roblox? Why not make games and get rich already? Why are you still wearing those old clothes? Aren't you rich now? Zoe didn't know how to answer because she still lived in the same old apartment, ate sandwiches her mum made, and loved sitting alone in the library reading outdated manuals. What the world called genius didn't make her feel different, but the way people treated her now created the real distance. Teachers started assigning her special homework, even though she never asked. The principal invited Ava to a meeting and suggested Zoe be placed in an accelerated program, which meant skipping grades and joining a different academic environment. We believe Zoe deserves a more fitting environment. Ava glanced out of the hallway at her daughter slumped over her backpack. She knew more fitting was not what her child needed. Zoe didn't need to skip grades. She needed space to stay curious. That night, Aiden and Zoe revisited legacy code from version 3.1 at the Unboxed lab. See this, Zoe pointed to a section. They never fixed the backup authentication flow, thought no one would dig that deep. Aiden nodded, the software worlds like urban development. Patch over patch, never tear down the old. Zoe laughed. So what if we're digital janitors? Aiden chuckled too. Then the work's never done. A moment passed. Then Zoe asked Aiden, when you got fired, were you sad? Not as sad as when no one asked why. Zoe reflected. Same. I'm not sad when people call me weird, just sad when no one tries to understand why. Aiden looked at her. He saw something most adults would miss. This girl didn't need cheering, she just didn't need to be pushed. That weekend, Ava took Zoe to the park. Zoe brought her notebook and an unfinished Raspberry Pi setup. Other kids ran, shouted, and slid down the playground. Zoe sat under a tree. Another girl her age approached shyly. What are you doing? Zoe looked up. Someone asked with genuine curiosity for the first time, not from headlines. I'm testing a sound sensor. If it works, it'll mute car horns that exceed a certain level. Whoa, I never thought of that. You want to try it? I don't know anything. Zoe smiled. I didn't either, until I tried. And then they worked together. One girl loved robots, and one girl was simply curious. There was no pressure expectations or flashbulbs, just understanding through building something real. Monday morning, the 14th floor of Quantum Dynamics lit up earlier than usual. It was not for emergency meetings, not for investors. but because it was the first day of Unboxed's pilot class designed for minds that didn't yet have a definition. A special group of students gathered around a round table in a room filled with whiteboards and wires. There were no uniforms, no identical laptops, and each brought what they were good at: a boy with hand-wired circuits from an old printer, a girl with a robot model made of cereal boxes, and even a deaf student who signed words but typed code at lightning speed. Zoe sat among them, not teaching, not lecturing, just observing, guiding when needed, and most importantly, listening. She didn't need to be called Miss Zoe. She just wanted to be there as a peer, as someone who once knew what it felt like to be misunderstood. Aiden Garcia entered slowly, holding a prototype board. Lesson 1, he said, isn't about tech. It's about mindset. He wrote on the board, it's not about what you know. It's about what you dare to ask. The kids stayed silent, no frantic note-taking. They were listening not just with their ears, but with their minds. Zoe smiled faintly. Meanwhile, upstairs in the executive suite, Ethan Thomas addressed the board. We have our first 13 candidates from across the country. No transcripts, no trophies, but each passed a real-world challenge, not graded by score, but by how they think when no answer is given. A board member asked, "Won't this set a dangerous precedent? Can anyone without formal training demand a seat?" Ethan responded without hesitation, "No. What's dangerous is pretending that training is the only measure of human worth." The room fell silent. That evening, Ava and Zoe sat on their apartment balcony eating instant noodles. Under the streetlights, the city rushed by, but the balcony was the quietest place in the world. "I know you'll change many things," Ava said, brushing Zoe's hair. "But I just hope you don't lose yourself." Zoe thought for a moment. "I don't need to change to fit in. People need to change to listen." "Where'd you learn that?" "Didn't. I remember how it felt to be ignored." A week later, Zoe received a letter, not printed, not typed, handwritten in bold strokes. "Thank you for seeing what I saw when no one else did. You finished what I started. Now it's time to begin what no one dared to imagine." Signed, Aiden G. Zoe folded the letter and placed it in her notebook. On the last page, the one she'd carried since day one at Quantum, she wrote the first line of a new chapter: "We're not bugs, we're the update." And below she listed names, not donors, not professors, but Tyler, who codes with his left hand because school computers are locked. Lily, who builds robots out of ramen boxes. Amari, who can't hear people but hears data. Zoe closed the notebook. She was no longer the invisible girl in the public library. She was the first in a world yet to be named, a world about to be rewritten, and the first line of code belonged to a child.